Shukr Rabbi Yaakov, and thank you for putting together this whole conference, which undoubtedly will be of help to many Jewish families. Baruch Hashem, the clock is right in front of me. You know the story about the rabbi who gave a particularly long drasha on Shabbos. And it was like really, really long. And at the Kiddush, the president of the shul was sort of staring at the rabbi funny. The rabbi says, "Whoa, you look upset." And the president of the shul says, "Rabbi, come on, the drasha, it was out of hand." He said, "What was out of hand?" He says, "It's really, really, really long." He says, "Well, the rabbi says, there's a problem, is that there's no clock in the sanctuary." He says, "Rabbi, yes, but there's a calendar." So, now I do have a clock, and Baruch Hashem, and I think, I won't tell you, I won't disclose the time to you, but at a certain time coming very soon, there's a car waiting for me to take me up to North Hollywood, and so I'm conscious of that, and we're going to try to move through the points quickly. We're talking about tonight, anyone saw the topic? How to raise spiritual children in a material world. Let's go. Yeah, that's. By the way, if you learn one parenting skill from this whole conference, a krechts is probably right there at the top of the list. Sometimes there's something very humble about it, something very, Eibishter, I can't, but you can, and help me, Eibishter. We cannot do this alone. How do we raise spiritual children in a material world? So let's go back to the very beginning of Judaism, to the very first Jewish home. The very first Jewish home was Sarah Imeinu's tent. Sarah was the first Yiddish mama. And in Sarah's home, we are told that there were three hallmarks, three distinguishing features. In fact, these three features were so related with Sarah that how did Yitzchak know that when Rivka was brought to him that she was the one? That these three signs returned to the home. What were they according to Medrash? First thing was a bracha metzuya b'isa. There was a blessing found in the dough. And that meant that no matter how many guests Avraham would invite for Shabbos, Sarah always had enough food to satiate. The other sign, the second sign, was that there was an anan kashur ba'ohel, a protective cloud over the tent, which gave shelter. And the third was ner doluk me'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos, that the Shabbos candles of Sarah Imeinu stayed lit from one Friday afternoon until the next. These are the three signs. So interesting, in a Sikha, the Lubavitcher Rebbe asks a question. Why these three signs? These were the only nisim that happened with Sarah. We know there were nisim all the time. There were malachim appearing on a regular basis. So why these three things? Well, not four, not five. So the Rebbe says that they're actually categories. They're actually categories, and they are categories of the three indispensable or irreducible needs of the Jewish home. The first one, bracha metzuya b'isa, there's a blessing in the dough. The first thing that a balabasta needs to have, the first thing a Jewish home needs to have, is you have to have what to eat. And we don't relate to this. Baruch Hashem, we've grown up in affluence, but if you ask your grandparents or great-grandparents, they knew what it was to scrimp and to save and to worry about having what to eat. So that's the first category. Next category, the protective cloud over the tent. Well, just like you need to have food, you also have to have shelter. A Jewish home is primarily a home, but the home has to have a house, right? Like, you have a minyan of 10 guys davening in a parking lot, that's not a shul. You have to have a building with 4 walls, a structure where to put that minyan, and then you have a shul. So the main thing is the home, but you have to have the home in a house. You have to have a building. And it's not just the four walls, it's the decor, it's the furnishings, all of the physical space that is there to be conducive to a comfortable life for the Jewish family. Okay, that's the second category. So we have food, we have shelter, okay? Category 3, what was the third thing with Sarah? Anyone remember? What? Shabbos candles. Okay, what are the Shabbos candles? Shabbos candles are light. Lichtigkeit. What's the Lichtigkeit in a Jewish home? It's that intangible quality, that sense of purpose, that sense of mission, that clarity, light. It's also warmth, the Warmkeit, sense of love, compassion, the intangibles of the Jewish home. Okay, now, if I were to ask you, which of these 3 categories is unlike the other 2? What would you say? The third is different than the first 2. Yeah, in what sense? So the first 2, bracha matzoi be'isa, that's food. Anakasha ba'oil, that's shelter. Those are, in a word, material. Those are material, or in another word, tangible resources. Very important, indispensable, but tangible. And the third category, the Warmkeit und Lichtigkeit, the warmth and the light of the Jewish home, that's the spiritual quality, the intangible. Okay. And they're all 3 indispensable categories. The question is, when you are forced into a situation where you have to prioritize, see, how do you know how to prioritize things? How do you know what value something has vis-a-vis something else, relative to something else? Is when there's a conflict, when you have to choose one over the other, or when you have to work on one first and then work on the others after. So if you had to prioritize, if you had to do either categories 1 and 2 first, and then category 3 after, or category 3 first, and then category 1 and 2 after, which way would you go? How would you decide? So I'll tell you like this. In a certain way, we here, 2020, Los Angeles, American Jews, most probably not first-generation American Jews, we are the product of a great experiment, a great failed experiment, but I guess even a failed experiment isn't a failure because it proves a point, where for the first time in Jewish history, we were convinced, as a people, as a culture, that if we would have material prosperity first and foremost, then everything else would be good. So our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, whoever it was who came over here, they left behind material instability and insecurity, where they didn't have what to eat. They didn't have protection under the rule of law. Maybe they couldn't even own property. And they came to a Golden Medina, they came to America as a land of freedom and opportunity, and they came here for material security. It's ironic because why was America founded? The Puritans, the Pilgrims who came over here, they came here for religious freedom, to pursue spiritual means, or ends, rather. Most Jews did not come over here because they thought the spirituality would be better over here. That's not the story. I mean, we all know the stories of the Jews coming over on the boats from Europe and throwing their tefillin overboard and saying, "Goodbye, God, this is the last I'll see you. I'm going to America." And maybe that's not the story in your family, and if it's not, you're the exception. You're in the lucky minority, because most American Jews do not have such a story. Americans came here, or rather, Jews came here, became Americans, and they were convinced that by finally having some material security, this would be good for the Jews. If we could finally feel safe, stable, bread on the table, a nice home, 2 cars in the garage, college education, a profession, a career. And this will be good for everything. This will be good for the Jews. It'll be good for Judaism. And like I said, Baruch Hashem, it was a failed experiment because we know that that is not how it turned out. That those who prioritized having the American dream, the white picket fence, saw that there's a reason why for 3,000 years of Jewish history, we always did it the other way around. Now, most of the time, it was not by choice. It wasn't by choice that we chose spiritual priorities over material priorities. It was forced upon us. It wasn't like we had options to pursue material security. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at 3,300 years of Jewish history, most of our story, and especially the past 2,000 years, which is the bulk of our history, meaning our history in Golus, in exile, it's a story of Jews not having material stability, not having a homeland to call their own, not having autonomy, not having rights under the law, not being able to own property, not having a way to earn a living. And yet, the Jewish people have outlasted and outlived all of their oppressors. All of the mighty empires who had the greatest material security in the world have come and they've gone. And the Jewish people have shown that when we have Torah, when you have spiritual light, not only do we survive, but we thrive. So we are in an interesting position now. A very interesting position. Different from the story of all of the generations that came before us. Because we live in the richest Jewish community anywhere at any time in history. And the question becomes, in order to preserve Jewish continuity, will it be required for us to go back to the shtetl? Will we have to renounce the bourgeois lifestyle, go back to simpler times, and maybe that's what it's going to take? I present the question. I know that sometimes it feels that way when kids are coming home talking about the latest gadget. When they're coming up talking about, especially, I mean, can I say it? Because, we're in LA, the industry, and everyone knows what industry doesn't mean making automobiles. We're not in Detroit, right? The industry is very good at putting out their message, and sweet Jewish children come home knowing about what's going on in pop culture, and thinking it's something very attractive, very interesting. So maybe, what do we need this for? Let's pack up, find out where our great-grandparents lived, and we'll go move there. We'll live in a one-bedroom house with a dirt floor. And maybe Yiddishkeit will be better. I'll tell you this, I'm not going to give you the answer so quickly, but I'll tell you this question. This question is a deep question. It's a real question. It's actually a machlekes of 2 great Jewish thinkers, not rabbis necessarily, but you can learn from everyone. It's a machlekes between Maslow and Frankel, two good Jewish boys, psychologists. Yeah? Who was Maslow? Who was Frankel? So Maslow, actually, he was an American Jew. He lived out here in California. And you ever seen anyone who studied a little bit of psychology? I mean, even I know. People think I studied psychology, by the way. The things I didn't. My father's a psychologist. I rebelled. I became a rabbi. But I grew up with the books in the house. And so if you've ever looked at a psychology textbook, you've probably seen what you're discussing, whether or not that's true. It's true. It really is. If you ever looked at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you ever seen that? Little triangle, right? So it's a little pyramid. And he has basically at the bottom, what does he have? the most important needs, which are biological needs. Like for instance, you need to breathe fairly often, right? You can't hold your breath that long, right? So if you come over to somebody and say, hey, where do you want to go for lunch? And they can't breathe, so they're not interested in talking about where to go for lunch because you need to breathe sooner than you need to eat, right? But then let's say they can breathe and you come over to them and you say, where are you sleeping tonight? And they don't have what to eat today. So, you know what, let's figure out where we're eating first, and then we'll figure out where we're sleeping because you need to eat sooner than you need to have shelter. And so on and so forth. There are priorities. And then you graduate out of material needs, right? Food and shelter and clothing and that kind of stuff, and you get to more intangible needs, like social life. You need to have companionship. You need to have people to talk to, right? You have to have people to hang out with. And that's not a physical, tangible thing, okay? But it's a need. It's a human need. And then you go even higher than that. If you have that need met, then you can go even higher. And ultimately, the very tip top, you have self-actualization, which means living according to a purpose, pursuing meaning. And that's the tippy top. That's the spitz of the pyramid. So Maslow, living in America, in Manifest Destiny, is all of American history is about pushing westward. So there's an expression: the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. California is like the United States, only more so. Okay, the ultimate extreme, exaggerated version of the American dream is the further west you go. So here we are, the end of the American dream. Maslow is out here in California, and his theory, and he's writing in the 1940s, okay, 1940s, and he's saying the ultimate is like this. First, you get the college education, the 2 cars in the garage, you get to go to the country clubs where you go, your neighbors go, and then we'll finally be safe and secure as Jews. He didn't say it that way. He didn't say it as a Jewish issue. But I'm saying here you have a Jewish boy who's writing in 1940s America, and he's saying, what do you have to do? You have to prioritize first the Gashmias, and then the Ruchnias will come. Very exact same time, but in the Altaheim, in the old country. Viktor Frankl, he's writing, the exact same time Maslow is writing in California, Viktor Frankl is writing in Austria. And he comes up with this idea called logotherapy, and that is the inverted pyramid. Basically, first thing you got to have meaning. And a lot of people think that he wrote his thesis on logotherapy, after he went to Auschwitz, and that it was based on his experience in Auschwitz. It's not true. He wrote it first as a theory, and then unfortunately, in the concentration camp, he had his theories affirmed for him. And he came out and he said, look, I saw people who were murdered. But then, in addition to that, there were people who, they didn't directly die from starvation, from violence, from disease. They died because they had nothing to live for. They didn't have meaning. And meaning is a need as real and as vital as water to drink, as air to breathe. It's very interesting, because that's what Jews always knew. What Frankl was writing back in Holocaust Europe is what Jews always knew, and they knew it firsthand. Maslow out in America is trying to flip the whole paradigm, trying to say something new that was never the way Jews survived, was never the truth for us. And it took 70 years, less than 70 years. Anyone with any honesty saw it right away. It didn't take too long for the results to be very clear, that the American experiment with Jewry, that prioritizing Gashmias before Ruchnias, was a failure. There was a Jewish radio host in England. He had a show on the BBC. His name was Hugo Green. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was in Auschwitz. He had an unusual story because he was actually in Auschwitz with his father. Why? Because he was young. He lied about his age in order to save his life. He was 15 years old in Auschwitz with his father. They were both there as slaves. And they were staying in the same barrack. So Hugo Green tells a story like this. He says, he remembers one bitter, freezing cold winter night in Auschwitz. They come back to the camp from a day of slave labor. They come back to the barrack where they're all kept. Freezing, bitter, bitter winter night. And he comes inside, and he is horrified to discern that his father is huddled in the corner, in the shadows of the barrack, stooped down, holding in his hands a piece of scrap metal that he'd picked up in the yard. He had a piece of cloth that he tore from his uniform. It was just the middle of the winter. It's freezing cold. They had nothing. They had just these threadbare uniforms. They didn't have adequate clothing. But he tore a piece of fabric from that uniform, and he had twisted it. And he had a slice of butter in Auschwitz. What he had to do to get that slice of butter, Hugo didn't know. But he saw his father had a little slice of butter. And he put it all together. Piece of scrap metal, torn piece of fabric, slice of butter. All of a sudden it clicked. He realized it was the first night of Hanukkah. And that his father was lighting the menorah in Auschwitz. Scrap metal was the base of the candelabrum, and the torn piece of fabric was the wick, and the butter was the oil, was the fuel. Hugo says he realized what was happening. He screamed out, "No!" Now, we don't relate to that. We can't guess why a 15-year-old in Hugo's position screamed out no. We would think, oh, maybe he was afraid, maybe he was upset that his father was being religious, maybe, no. And thank God we don't relate to it, and we don't understand that mindset. But do you know why he screamed out no? A very simple reason. Very primal. Thank God we don't relate to it. They were dying of starvation. A lick of butter on your tongue has enough fat, has enough calories to mean the difference between life and death for another day. See, we don't relate to that. He sees his father about to burn this slice of butter. It's going to it's going to go up into flames. Somebody could eat this and live off of this. He screams out, "No!" So his father turns to him, and Hugo Green related this story decades later. He says, "My father turned to me, and I will never forget my entire life what he said to me at that moment. He said, 'Hugo, if being in Auschwitz has taught us anything, it is that a man can live for many days without food. But he cannot live for one moment without the light of hope.'" So there's our answer. What's our answer? When there's a Jewish question, we say, is it A or is it B? What's the answer? Come on, Jews. C. Very good. Jewish audience. You know about the couple that went to the Rav for Shalom Bayis issues. The husband told his side of the story. The Rav says, "You're right." The wife told her side of the story. The Rav says, "You're right." The Rav's own wife, the Rebbitzin, was walking by. She overheard the whole thing. She pokes her head and she says, "They can't both be right." He says, "You're right." Okay, we laugh at that, but there's a reason. Because Yiddishkeit can't be confined. Yiddishkeit is Torah. Torah is Ein Sof. It's infinite. The infinite cannot be confined to one way or another. Obviously, when it comes to halacha, you have to pick a side. You got to do one thing because you can't do two things at once. But hashkafically, when we're talking about concepts, conceptually, it's both. It's always both. So here's the question. 3,000 years of history, 2,000 years of which are in Gullus, was putting Ruchnius first, but not by choice. Past 100 years, or even less than that, was putting Gashmius first. A grand failure. What's the future, the present and the future of Judaism? Gashmius or Ruchnius? Which one? Both. You know, when Rivka was pregnant, she wasn't sure why she felt such turmoil. And she went to the prophet in her time, and he told her that you have two children who are two nations, really two civilizations. You have Esav, who is Edom, the Romans, Western civilization, with all their great technological and material advancement. And you have Yankiv, who is the Jewish people, who are the great spiritual civilizers of the world, who bring morality and monotheism and modesty to the world. So they're diametrically opposed. He says they're fighting over two worlds. So I'll ask you a simple question. I don't understand why they're fighting over two worlds. Elam Haza and Elam Haba. If Esav is the Megushim, he's grub, he likes materiality, let him take Elam Haza. And if Yankiv is the Edel one, Yishtam Yeshvei Holm, he likes spirituality, let him take Elam Haba. Now they don't have to fight. So what's the fight? What's the fight? Why does Yankov Avinu want Elam Hazeh? They both want both, yeah. Why Esav wants Elam Haba, that's another discussion. But why do we also need Elam Hazeh? They say when the Vilna Gaon was on his deathbed, he was crying and he said to the Talmidim, he grabbed his talis cotton, he says, I'm about to leave a place where for a few kopecks you can buy one of these and do a mitzvah of Hashem and go to a world where for all the treasures, spiritual treasures in that world, you can't buy one mitzvah. The Baal Shem Tov was once, he saw, it was revealed to him, who's going to be with him in Gan Eden, who's going to be his roommate in Gan Eden. And he saw it was a tzaddik nister, and he wanted to meet the guy in Elam Hazeh, in this world. So they arranged it. So he went and he met the guy, and the guy was Baal Basar, he was a heavy guy. Imagine a heavy guy. Imagine. Okay, and thank you for going along with that. Anyways, so the Baal Shem Tov goes to this guy's house, and this guy's heavy, and he's eating the whole time. He's just eating, and from one meal to the next meal to the next meal. Finally, the Baal Shem Tov was like, what's up with the food? So the guy was a pashater. He was a tzaddik nister, and he was a ish pashat. He was a simple guy, straight shooter. So he says to the Baal Shem Tov, he says, oh yeah, that. He says, well, I'll tell you, my father was a parish, an ascetic. His father was a totally spiritual guy. He used to eat a crust of bread every day, drink lukewarm water, sleep on a bench in the Beis Medrash, never came home except Shabbos. He says, my father was a total parish, a recluse, and an ascetic. And he was like a frail little guy. He says, one time the Cossacks came into town, and they were drunk, and they were lawless, and they were out for blood. And they just wanted to grab any Jew they could to torture him. So everyone was hiding in their houses with the doors locked. And the only one they could find was my father, because when he was learning Gemara, he was lost. He was in another world. So he was the only one they could find. They walked in, they grabbed him, they schlepped him out of the shul, and they tied him up, and they set fire to him. He says he was so frail, he was so skinny, that when they set fire to him, he turned to ashes in moments. He was gone, just like that. So this ish pashat, this tzaddik nister, who eats a lot, he says to the Baal Shem Tov, he says, when they come for me, I'm going to burn for a good long time. Now, that's in the category of do not try this at home. But there's a point here. This guy, this tzaddik nister, he didn't see his gashmias as gashmias. He saw it all as potential ruchnias. So every pound of flesh that he packed onto his frame was more fuel for Kiddush Hashem. This is the story of Hugo Green and his father. Yeah, we need gashmias. Yeah, we need a stick of butter, a slice of butter. But what's a slice of butter? It's the light of Hanukkah. Yiddish gashmias is ruchnias. When we take the affluent lifestyle and we are mishabed that whole thing, we dominate it, we do it l'shem shamayim, and we say, no, this isn't going to use me, I'm going to use it. This is going to be a tool for serving Hashem. The Gashmias will serve the Ruchnias, like Yankov Avinu struggled for in the womb. That he wanted the Elam Hazeh, because Elam Hazeh is the fuel that turns into Elam Haba. Gashmias is Ruchnias if you know how to burn the fuel the right way. If you amass Gashmias, you just amass it, you store it up, you have more, and you have more, and you have more. It's worthless. Not only it's worthless, it causes, you look around, you see people who are drowning in their own affluence, in their own materiality. Because Gashmias was never meant to just amass that. It's like having tons and tons of fuel and saying, but I don't want to burn it, I don't want to expend it. What's fuel for other than to burn it and to expend it? Gashmias is fuel. Everything the Eibishter gives us, all the resources we have, are fuel. That's a heck of a ringtone over there. Haven't heard that one yet. You figure it out? Okay. Huh? So I told you I do have a car coming. So I'll leave you with a thought. Of course, once you know, when the guy goes up to turn it off, it turns off by itself. Okay. I'll leave you with a thought. Specific to chinuch. The Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah is describing a little bit of history, why we have a Chanukah, why we celebrate Chanukah. And one of the things he says about the Greeks is Pashtu Yodam b'Memeinam Shel Yisrael. They set forth their hand upon the Jewish wealth. So Lubavitcher Rebbe asks a question, what's with the poetic language? If you want to say they stole, say they stole. What is it? They set forth their hand. Pashtu Yodam. They extended their hand upon the Jewish wealth. So the Rebbe learns b'derech remez. It's al derech timu kol hashmonim. The Greeks didn't steal the oil in the Beis Hamikdash. They didn't even break the vials or the jars of oil. They didn't vandalize it, not begashmias in the classical sense. Timu kol hashmonim means that they just touched it or they shook it in order that it should become Shemen Tameh. And this what was the strategy there? Why did they bother to do this? This was important to the Greek ideology. The Greek ideology is there's spirituality, there's materiality, they're two separate worlds. Don't confuse them. And that's why the Greeks, they were very into Gashmias, they were into the physical body for its own sake, not to be healthy like the Rambam talks about. But by the way, that's why we eat jelly donuts on Hanukkah, because the Greeks were into physical fitness. We don't want to be like them. So the Greeks were very into Gashmias for its own sake. And they saw Yidden, we have this weird thing where we marry the physical and the spiritual, where we can say about a physical thing, oh, Shemen Tameh, Shemen Tahir. Tameh and Tahir, what are you talking about? Send it to a lab. Extra virgin olive oil. That's something you could see under a microscope. But Shemen Tameh and Shemen Tahir, those are spiritual designations to describe a physical object. In a Greek mind, that doesn't even make sense. How can you use spiritual terms to describe something physical? A physical thing, you use physical terms. Tall or short or heavy or light or what color it is. And here we are, Jews, we use spiritual terms to describe physical. Like Jews, we don't even eat. We don't say, does it taste good? Is it nutritious? We say, is it kosher is the first question. Oh, what's kosher? I mean, kosher is a spiritual designation. What's the difference between getting your work done on Friday and getting your work done on Saturday? Is there something different about the time? Oh, it's a spiritual designation. We Jews, we do this all the time. We take things of Elam Hazeh in time and space, and we give it spiritual designations. That's totally anti-Greek ideology. So what did the Greeks do? They purposely, they defiled the oil. They said, go, use it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's fine. Use it. There's nothing wrong with it. That's what means Timu Kol Hashmon. They give it a Greek touch. So Pashtu Yadam b'Meinam Shel Yisrael, they set forth their hands upon Jewish wealth. What does that mean? But Derech Remez, we could say, they didn't take away, they didn't confiscate Jewish wealth. They said, keep your wealth, but do it with a Greek touch. meaning you worked hard, you earned your money, buy yourself something pretty. But don't try to sanctify it. That's Jewish. That's crazy. That's weird. And we fought. We were Moser Nefesh. We fought to the death to defend our right to say that Gashmias can be the holiest thing. So therefore, what do we do on Hanukkah? Maloshin Chinuch, to educate our children. What's the one real custom? Aside for the mitzvah d'Rabban to light the menorah, but the real Jewish custom, to give children gelt, to give them money. Why? Because what's the Jewish statement? I'm giving you fuel. Gashmias is all potential ruchnias. You just have to know how to use it. It's fuel. Like Hugo Green's father did with the butter. Like the Tzaddik Nister was doing with every pound of flesh he packed onto his frame. So here's the bottom line, and I'm 5 minutes late. You guys didn't know that. I knew it, don't worry. For the majority of Jewish history, we put spirituality first because we had no Gashmias. Then for 100 years, we put Gashmias first. And we almost lost, God forbid, our Ruchnias. We're the first generation in history. We're the generation that's going to bring Mashiach, which is ultimately the time when this world becomes holier than heaven. The ultimate Ruchnias will be here in Elam Hazeh Hagashmi. Through the physical mitzvahs we perform in our physical bodies with physical objects. How do you raise spiritual children in the physical world? Hashem sent the precious neshamas of your spiritual children down to the physical world for a reason. It wasn't to torture us. It wasn't to waste our time. It was because the ultimate spirituality, from a Jewish perspective, can only be done in this physical world. Can only be done in this physical world. That's why the precious neshamas of your children had to come down. That's why Mashiach is tied to all of the Eitzes neshamas being emptied out into physical, and neshamas coming down to physical bodies to do physical mitzvahs with physical objects. That means basically in one sentence. Every bracha, all the resources, all the affluence, all the material abundance that we have, it's all fuel. It's all fuel. Figure out a way not to compete with secular Gashmias. We're Jews. We don't have to compete with secular Gashmias. Co-opt the Gashmias. Yankiv will conquer both worlds. Take them both from Esav. That means whatever that Elam Hazeh, the best that Elam Hazeh has to offer, we have to offer Yiddishkeit and the nicest, most slick, most professional. I mean, like a conference like this, in the most stylish, everything should be done to the T in a beautiful way. The Eibishter gave us resources. We have to use those resources. Then our children never feel that there's something more attractive out there. Maybe in the shtetl, that's how you had to do it. You had to tell your children, don't be attracted by the fancy stuff that's out there in the world. Because we didn't have anything to compete with. Today, we don't even have to compete. All we have to do, the Eibishter. You know, the rabbi got up, he says, I have good news and bad news. The good news is we have the money to finish the building project. The bad news is the money's still all in your checking accounts. We have, Baruch Hashem, all the money to give our children the best ruchnias that ever existed for any generation ever in the history of Klal Yisrael.